Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and various other undesirables. We are Adventuresome Reviews, and today we are reviewing The Guardian of Light by Sean Connaughton, or some variation thereof. Which we had to bully the author most horribly to get this book. It was horrible. Now, this is This is a book that was submitted to us to review. And yeah, I know that, but it's a much better story if we bullied the author to give it to us. Regardless, this is our review of it, as requested. The synopsis is as follows. A magical prison in the South Pole is attacked by the worst villains from myth and legend. They are then set free to wreak havoc upon the world. Ooh, ah. One makes his way to the North Pole and manages to murder the current Guardian of Light, or as us plebeians know the poor bugger, Santa Claus. Ooh, ah. I am paraphrasing quite horribly, so... With less than 2 months left before Christmas, the Guardians of the North Pole must find a new Guardian to train to protect the light of the world. Shane Connor was just your average, everyday nice guy. He had his ups and downs in life, but he always did his best just to get by and live the best life he could. Then, on a very strange morning, various hours of his life go missing. The strange occurrences cause him his medium-wage job and his high-maintenance girlfriend. Shane realizes he needs a new job, but he never could imagine what happens next. Will Shane be able to rise up and wear the mantle of the Guardian of Light and save not only Christmas, but the world? This epic fantasy series re-sparks the inner child in any grown reader and reminds you of a time when you once believed in the most important thing in the world, to believe. Ooh, ah. Yes, very exciting stuff. Unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy this book. Yeah, I would have to agree with you. There were various parts of the book that were handled well. For instance, like, the author's macro view of the story was pretty solid. However, his prose is his prose is weak. It's just... inexperienced is what I was going to say. Because the end result is still the same, that the prose failed to deliver on the narrative, and so, along with some other choices, sometimes made it a little bit hard to get through. Not hard as in, oh my god, this is misery, but it just sapped enjoyment out of what, for me, was initially an interesting prospect, the reimagining of the Santa Claus and the Christmas and all those fables. And it's something that's been touched on before, but still. And it is something that the author handles relatively well. For me at least, there were several parts throughout the story where I was engaged in the lore and the myth of the world. And there were some cool little bits of world building or imagination at work as well. And the very first chapter was also, like, as first chapters go, the breaking in of a top secret prison to release all the horrors of nightmare and whatnot, that's a fairly strong first chapter. Yeah. Just the prose throughout the story was inexperienced and just failed the story horribly. Yeah. I was a little bit more on the fence for the world building as well, because there are definitely some elements I liked about it, but there was also a lot of it that is just an exploration of the North Pole and the Santa Claus mythos that is what people are very familiar with. The fabricating of the toys, the elves, and that was more tedious to get through because I knew all of it, and the author doesn't really build upon the existing or change the existing mythos in a way that really forces the reader to reconsider what's going on. Because one of the few he does multiple different species of elves, which is a merging of the Santa Claus elves and the more high fantasy elves. But that doesn't change the mechanics of the scenery, per se. That doesn't change the mechanics of the Santa Claus mythos or how it interacts with the world. It's just a little bit of flavor text. And that made a lot of the world building for me a little bit more of, I want to get back to the story. I don't want to spend chapter after chapter exploring the North Pole.
Kind of briefly touching kind of on that. That's a theme that is recurrent throughout the story. Frequently, our main protagonist, Shane Connor, would encounter something new and exciting, and us as the readers, we clearly say, okay, that is clearly a result of magic. Shane, both the author and Shane, however, then take the time to ask what's going on here and receive the repetitive explanation of magic, which was largely unnecessary, and it kind of ties back into the re-exploring something that is very basically understood about this myth.
I think some of that is because the author felt he had to explore the North Pole because that's sort of... It was an instance where the names of it sparked initial interest, the North Pole, Santa Claus, Mab, and a lot of the main dropping, but it then necessitated the exploration thereof. You had to serve your subject material, as opposed to exploiting it for maximum value.
So, the name dropping is actually when I was most engaged in the story. And it's not necessarily the fact that he dropped names. No, it's the book's rogues gallery I found was when I was most engaged. And you had this fairly long point of exposition wherein Shane was introduced to the history of the Santa Claus role and the Guardians of Light, and it was this long. It was not long because the book itself is not long. It's actually relatively well paced, and so. But anyway, you had this introduction to the villains and past Santa Clauses and how the mantle was progressed throughout the eras and generations, and usually this could be actually fall prey to extreme boredom because it's just a massive exposition. But I'm not entirely sure what it did well or how it differentiated itself, but I was engaged throughout all this because it was a history of how the Santa Clauses were one by one or successively knocked down by this series of villains, and all these villains through the course of the thing, they developed a degree of power and threat that was beneficial to the story, particularly when you started realizing that the villains are now loose on the world, and each one of them killed an experienced Guardian of Light. And now Shane, who is an inexperienced Guardian Light, has to deal with them all by himself.
I think one of the reasons it works for you is that you have a degree of connection to all the rogues. We understand who Mab is. We have partial understanding of Puck, of Krampus, and of Morgana, and etc. And so it's the names and the inherent story of them that carries that exposition narrative. The exposition narrative itself isn't immensely interesting because, again, it's a list of sequences and events, and since you have to go through a lot of names and events, they're fairly short. Otherwise, it would become too much. And it's actually a situation, well, no, I can't even say that. I was going to say it would be a situation that optimally you'd want to space it out a little bit more so you could really build up the story of all the individual Santa Clauses and their histories. But A, the book's not long enough for that, and C, the story already is a little bogged down with the exploration of the world. There is very little actual narrative story that's explored. 70% of the book is
exposition and explaining that magic is what causes all these mystical events that Shane encounters. And that, for me, is probably something that bothers me a little more, or it doesn't bother me. it's something I find a little more depressing because when the story actually got down to narrative, it was actually when it was really pretty good. Because Shane wakes up on the dot, his buzzer rings, he gets up, he gets in the shower, and by the time he comes out of the shower, he is flabbergasted by the fact that he has lost 5 hours of his life.
3 hours.
Regardless. And this causes a cascade effect that we see the strings being pulled, but Shane himself has no idea what's going on because he is not part of the magical world. And so once again, that is a solid chapter, right? And then he starts looking for a job fairly quickly thereafter, which is, a relatively appealing character trait in a guy. And he's getting constantly tagged with phone messages and email telling him, hey, come look at this job. Woo, very exciting, great pay. But he ignores it because he thinks it's spam. And so what eventually happens is the world starts contorting around him so that he has no choice but to end up at this job interview.
That was one of my favorite parts about the book, where he was interacting with the magic. He didn't understand what was going on.
He wasn't even saying, hey, this is magic, this is weird. He's just like, am I going crazy? Which is an incredibly powerful and enjoyable narrative to be going on, particularly in the first few chapters.
And even though the reader knows what's going on, it's still appealing just because it's where the magic of the book is the most, not unique or original, but is the most non-fettered.
Because the author doesn't bother to explain or give signs, it's just happening, and he's allowing the reader to recognize that, oh, this is what's happening, and leaving it at that. So it's where the prose and was actually firing on all cylinders. Because there's like this one part where Shane literally gets out of his car, walks down a corner, turns and finds the exact same street again, but his car is not there, right? So then he backtracks to the original street where he parked the car, and the car is still there. And so it's kind of creepy, and just, you see how the forces of light can change the world to fit their ends.
Then he gets to the North Pole, and you
get bogged down with explanation.
And then you go into the, where his training montage, finger quotes montage. It's not really montage, but he gets set out a series of classes he has to attend, and the author walks you through all those classes. There's potion making, spell casting, history, and it becomes a school story for about a quarter of the book, but again, there's no stakes, there's no conflict. Lessons in of themselves aren't unique, the author isn't introducing you to an entirely unique or original magic system. It is, will this magic, the spell happens.
With a focus such as a wand or a staff.
And that results in these classes, besides moments here and there where, again, or a little bit of the visual panache or the imagination or the history comes in, the classes become a little bit tedious to get through. And so, again, that's part of where I did not particularly enjoy this book comes in, is that so much of it was that tedious exploration and not enough story.
It's kind of funny because the authors spent a great deal of time tediously exploring everything that we inherently knew about the story. The parts of it that we did not initially know or are new and strange and original, those are the ones where the author stepped back and let the story tell itself, and that's when the story was actually just really good. Or not really good, but was at its best.
Yeah. I think that's more or less...
It's kind of beating a dead horse, but just because it's of particular interest to me, the book did not handle characters very well.
Oh yeah, it had...
Not that they were bad or dislikable, they were just such tools for the narrative.
The character was not a focus point of the book. It was, the characters were there to conduct the readers through them. And maybe the author is doing the whole, you have to have a sort of superficial bland character so the reader can imagine themselves inside of it.
But that only works for the main character. You don't necessarily want your potion master to be a blank slate whose only lines or clinical descriptions of how to make potions. And that is a description for almost all the characters. It's clinical, straight to the point, no personality.
Clinical isn't the correct
Not
word.
exactly, but
there was not enough effort put into giving them distinctive, vibrant, or unique personalities. Again, like you said, they served the plot. And that was all the effort that was put into them. And occasionally a service code of something, but they were never given distinguishing traits, speech patterns, desires, or fears. Nothing. Which is why they only exist to further the plot. And Shane himself is guilty of this to an extent. And you're in your head, so you can get a little bit more of the emotional level of it, but he did not have a concerted character that you could really point off and say, this is what the author was trying to do here. Shane is this, Shane is that. He's, again, just the vessel.
Yeah. And despite all these, I actually kind of view the book as being a fairly decent child's book, kind of that young adult read. Simply because there are lots of parts of the book that I liked, as we've discussed. For me, the main drawback to the book is the author's inexperience. Feels inexperienced from the prose to the choice of what to include and what to include.
Prose and narrative structure.
And it's like book 2 and book 3, I feel are all actually going to improve dramatically.
I don't know, I can't say on that, because it also just depends on how long it takes to read, or rather to write, and the span in between books. I would have given the book about 2 stars, 2.5 if I was feeling generous. I just didn't like it.
Yeah, I'd probably have to give it like 2.5. I feel like the book has potential, and it has potential because the author has had the grasp of macro, right?
Again, the book had potential, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. It is so horribly torpedoed by just the inexperience of the prose. That's our terribly depressing and lambasting review.
Yeah. Oh well.
Oh well.
We hope you all have wonderful lives and much happiness and joy.
And you don't take any governmental contracts to take us out or anything, you know. No hiring killers on us. That we have enough of those already.
It's illegal.
Yes, and it's tedious for us, so fare thee well, our future friends.
Goodbye.